The scream came from the laundry room. It wasn't just a cry, it was the kind of sound that stops the world for a second. Pastor Daniel's fingers froze on the pages of his Bible. He had just come back home to grab it. A quick stop, nothing more. But that sound shattered the stillness of the house he thought he knew. He dropped the Bible. It hit the floor with a dull thud as he ran. The corridor was filled with the smell of starch and detergent. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, cutting lines across the tiled floor. Each step seemed heavier than the last, because something deep inside him already knew this wasn't just an accident. He pushed the door open, and there, between the hiss of steam and the tremor of silence, stood Miriam, his wife, the same woman who led the women's fellowship, the same soft-spoken figure everyone in the church called Mama Daniel. Her hand trembled, the hot iron still steaming on the board beside her. Before her, the young maid, Grace, knelt, frightened, shaking, whispering through tears, "Please, madam, I didn't do anything." For a moment, time refused to move. The only sound was the iron cooling, that faint ticking sound of metal losing heat. "Miriam," the pastor's voice cracked, "what are you doing?" The question hung between them like smoke. She looked at him, eyes wide, face pale, as if she herself didn't know how she'd reached this point. The iron slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. That was the moment everything broke. The image that would haunt him, not because of the act itself, but because of what it revealed. Behind every polished sermon, every Sunday smile, every hallelujah there was something festering: pride, jealousy, silence. Earlier that morning, Pastor Daniel had left to visit a sick member of the congregation, a quick errand of compassion. He'd even told Miriam to rest. She'd been complaining of headaches for days, but halfway down the street, he realized he'd forgotten his Bible, the one with his notes and the pressed flower Grace had tucked inside last Easter. He smiled, thinking of his wife waiting at home. He imagined the aroma of lunch, the sound of worship music in the kitchen. He wanted to surprise her. Instead, he walked into a storm he didn't know had been building for months. Grace had been with him for 6 months, a girl of barely 20, from a nearby village. Her father had died early. Her mother washed clothes for neighbors to survive. When the church's welfare committee met her, Pastor Daniel felt something stir in his conscience. "Let her work in our home," he'd said. "We'll help her save for school." Grace accepted with gratitude, quiet, polite, diligent. She never raised her voice, never argued. She moved through the house like sunlight, gentle and warm. But in Miriam's eyes, that light was a threat. It began subtly, a glare here, a sharp tone there, small remarks that stung more than they should have. "You smile too much," Miriam would say. A maid should know her place. Grace always lowered her gaze, whispering apologies she didn't owe. The pastor noticed the tension, but he didn't press. He told himself it was just stress, that his wife would come around. He was wrong. That morning, the spark came from something as small as a shirt, a white one, his favorite. Grace had burned its sleeve while ironing. She gasped when she saw the mark, her heart pounding, not because of the shirt, but because she knew what it meant. She tried to fix it, to hide it, but Miriam had already entered the room. "What happened?" Miriam demanded. "Madam, I'm sorry. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Her voice rose. "This is my husband's shirt. You think you can ruin everything and smile your way out of it?" Grace tried to speak, but Miriam's anger drowned her out. The words poured like acid, accusations of disrespect, of seduction, of betrayal. It wasn't about the shirt anymore. It was about everything Miriam feared but never said out loud. Because somewhere deep in her heart, Miriam had started to believe that Grace was taking her place, that the pastor's kindness toward the girl meant something more. And once jealousy takes root, it doesn't whisper, it screams. So when Pastor Daniel opened that door, what he saw wasn't just violence, it was the face of envy in its purest form. "Miriam," he said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. She stepped back, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, voice shaking. "She was lying. She was smiling at you." Grace sobbed, trembling, clutching her arm. Pastor Daniel knelt beside her, gently lifting her to her feet. "You're safe now," he said softly. He turned to his wife, the woman he had once believed incapable of cruelty. "You need to leave this room." Miriam didn't move. For the first time in years, she looked small, like the mask had finally fallen, and what lay beneath was fear, not power. He called for help. He wrapped Grace's arm with a damp cloth, his hands shaking. He didn't know whether to cry or pray. Within an hour, the ambulance arrived. The driver was a church member. He didn't ask questions, he could see enough in their eyes. By evening, the story had already begun to spread. In small towns, secrets travel faster than light. Did you hear? They whispered. The pastor's wife attacked the maid. No, that can't be true. She's the one who leads the women's fellowship. Wait until Sunday, let's see what he says. And through it all, Pastor Daniel sat alone in his study, staring at the open Bible on his desk. The same Bible he had dropped that morning. The page was creased at Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, something inside him shifted, a painful, necessary awakening. He realized that his own home had become the sermon he never preached. That night, he prayed not for strength to defend himself, but for courage to face the truth, because the next step would test everything he had ever taught about forgiveness, justice, and love. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the start of something powerful. I spent days crafting this story for you, a story about how easily goodness can be shadowed by pride, and how justice often begins at home. So before we continue, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me bring more stories like this to you, stories that remind us what truth really costs. Morning came with silence, not peace, silence. Pastor Daniel sat by the window, staring at the gray dawn leaking through the curtains. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt hollow, as if every wall was holding its breath. Grace had been taken to the clinic the night before. The doctor said she'd heal, but it would take time. What he didn't say was that the emotional wound might never close the same way. Miriam had locked herself in the guest room, refusing to speak. Every so often, Daniel heard muffled sobs, but he didn't know whether they came from guilt or fear of being found out. He thought of the congregation. Tomorrow was Sunday. How could he stand at the pulpit and preach about love when his home had become its contradiction? He opened his Bible again, but the words blurred. His hands shook. He whispered, "Lord, what do I do now?" At the clinic, Grace lay still, her arm bandaged. The nurse told her to rest, but she couldn't stop replaying the moment, the look on her madam's face, the fear in the pastor's voice. She wasn't angry. She was simply ashamed. Ashamed that kindness had led her into danger. When Pastor Daniel arrived, she turned away. "Grace," he said softly, "I came to check on you." She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "I don't know what to say," he continued. "What happened to you shouldn't have happened in my house." She finally looked at him, her eyes swollen from crying. "Sir, please don't let them send me away. I didn't mean any trouble." The pastor's heart twisted. "You're not the one in trouble, my child. You did nothing wrong." She swallowed hard, unsure whether to believe him, because in her world, when the powerful fall, the powerless often pay the price. By afternoon, whispers had turned into stories. Some said Grace had provoked her madam. Some claimed the maid was using charms to win the pastor's favor. Others said it was all a misunderstanding, that enemies of the church were spreading lies. Each version grew taller, wilder, until the truth was buried under the weight of gossip. Miriam's friends began calling, asking what really happened. She didn't answer. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her hands trembled. She remembered the day Daniel proposed, how certain she had been that God had chosen them to lead together. But somewhere along the way, admiration turned into ownership. She had built her identity around being the pastor's wife, and the thought of losing that spotlight had terrified her. Now, she had become the very thing she used to preach against. That night, the elders gathered at Daniel's house. Their faces were grim. "Pastor," Elder Matthew said, "the congregation is restless. Some people are already talking on social media. They want to know the truth." Daniel looked down. "And if I tell them the truth?" There was silence. One elder cleared his throat. "It might destroy the church." "Then what am I preserving?" Daniel asked quietly. "A building without integrity." No one spoke. He knew they meant well, but he couldn't preach righteousness on Sunday and hide sin on Monday. When the meeting ended, he sat alone again. He thought about Miriam, not just her action, but what had driven her there. He had noticed her jealousy months before, but he had dismissed it as insecurity. Now he saw that silence had made him complicit. Near midnight, Miriam opened the door to his study. She looked exhausted. "Daniel," she whispered, "I can't sleep." He gestured for her to sit. For a long while, she said nothing. Then her voice broke. "I don't know why I did it. I felt like she was taking you away. Every time you thanked her, every time you smiled at her, I hated it." Daniel's chest tightened. "Grace is a child, Miriam. She's our responsibility, not our rival." Tears streamed down her face. "I know, but when people look at me now, I can feel their judgment. I can already hear them whispering, You'll stand in church and they'll all see her instead of me. He wanted to be angry, but all he felt was sadness. Do you remember our vows? He asked. We promised to be an example of grace. What will they learn from us now? She sobbed harder. Please don't leave me. I won't, he said. But I can't protect you from truth. He rose and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights blinked like scattered prayers. Tomorrow, I'll speak to the church. Her head jerked up. No, Daniel, they'll destroy us. He turned, eyes wet but steady. Better to be destroyed by truth than live comfortably in. The church was full before sunrise. People had come not just to worship, but to watch. Daniel walked to the pulpit slowly, Bible in hand. Miriam sat in the front row, her eyes red. Grace wasn't there, she was still recovering. When the murmurs died down, Daniel took a deep breath. My brothers and sisters, he began, today I will not preach a sermon. Today, I will confess. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. He continued, a few days ago, something happened in my home that has shaken me to my core. I will not hide it. My wife, our beloved leader, lost control and hurt someone who serves in our house. Grace. Gasps filled the room. Daniel paused, letting the words sink in. We preach love every day, but what good is a message that cannot survive behind closed doors? He looked directly at the congregation. If you came today expecting perfection, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I am a man who failed to see the pain growing under my own roof. He closed his eyes briefly. Pray for my wife, pray for Grace, and pray for every household where silence covers sin. Then he stepped away from the pulpit. For a moment, the entire room was silent. Then, slowly, a few stood up and began to clap, not applause of joy, but of respect, for truth. Miriam bowed her head and wept openly. Days later, Grace returned home, not to work, but to gather her things. When she stepped inside, the air felt different, lighter, somehow. Miriam approached her carefully. Grace, she said softly, I don't deserve your forgiveness. Grace hesitated. Madam, I've already forgiven you. Why? Miriam asked through tears. Because if I don't forgive, I'll carry the pain forever. That single line pierced everyone in the room. The pastor nodded slowly, humbled. You're free to go back to your studies, Grace. The church will cover your tuition. Her eyes widened. Sir, thank you. She left quietly, but not without looking back once. A small, uncertain smile that spoke of both fear and faith. The following weeks were difficult. Some members left the church. Others stayed but avoided eye contact. But those who remained began to see the pastor not as a distant figure, but as a man fighting to live the very truth he preached. Miriam attended counseling arranged by the church's elders. She began volunteering at a shelter that supported domestic workers, women like Grace. And Grace, for the first time, felt seen not as a servant, but as a survivor. Pastor Daniel continued his ministry, quieter now, more thoughtful. He no longer preached long sermons about sin. He spoke instead about mercy, the kind that costs something. What would you have done if you were in their place? Would you have hidden the truth to save your reputation, or spoken up knowing it might destroy everything? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know your thoughts before we continue. Weeks passed, but peace did not return. What had started as a whisper in the congregation had grown into a public storm. Social media posts appeared with blurry pictures of the pastor's gate. News blogs titled "The Story Scandal in the Sanctuary." The church board called an emergency meeting. For the first time in 15 years, Pastor Daniel walked into the elders' room not as their leader, but as a man under scrutiny. Elder Matthew cleared his throat. Pastor, the district council has heard of the incident. They are sending an investigator. Daniel nodded slowly. That is expected. Another elder, Elder Sarah, leaned forward. We stand with you, sir, but the council may ask your wife to step down from all leadership roles. Miriam sat beside him, eyes cast down. She hadn't spoken since entering the room. I understand, Daniel replied. Let them do what is right. Elder Matthew hesitated. There's one more thing. Grace's family filed a complaint. The authorities may visit the house. Miriam's head jerked up. Her voice trembled. They want to destroy us. No, Daniel said quietly. They just want truth. The room fell silent. Soft strings rise. For years, the church had treated Daniel as untouchable, a man above scandal. Now, they saw him differently, still righteous, but human. At her mother's small house on the edge of town, Grace sat at the table, hands folded. Her uncle paced the floor. They think they can buy silence, he said. You must press charges, Grace. They need to learn. Her mother sighed. But the pastor helped us. He paid your school fees. Grace looked from one to the other. I don't want revenge. I just want peace. Her uncle frowned. Peace? Peace doesn't change anything. Justice does. Grace's voice broke. Justice isn't hatred, uncle, it's truth. He paused, caught off guard by the strength in her tone. Later that night, she wrote a statement for the authorities, simple, honest, without bitterness. She asked that Miriam receive counseling rather than prison. When the officer read it the next morning, he said softly, "You are kinder than most people I meet in my work." Grace smiled faintly. "I just don't want to become what hurt me." 2 days later, the investigator arrived at the church office, a middle-aged woman named Officer Ngozi, known for her calm demeanor. She asked Daniel simple questions: where, when, why. He answered everything without hesitation. When she finished taking notes, she said, "You could have hidden this." He met her gaze. "If I did, I'd lose the only thing worth keeping, my conscience." She nodded. "Few men in your position think that way." That evening, Miriam stood before her mirror again. The reflection looked hollow, eyes tired, shoulders heavy. She thought about her youth, the girl who had dreamed of serving God, the one who used to visit orphanages with joy. Where had that girl gone? Her chest tightened. She sank to the floor and whispered through tears, "Lord, how did I become this?" The door opened softly. Daniel entered. "I heard you crying," he said. She looked up at him, broken. "I'm losing everything." He knelt beside her. "Maybe what we are losing is what we never needed: titles, applause, masks." She shook her head. "And you? They'll turn against you because of me." He took her hand. "Let them. I'd rather stand alone in truth than surrounded by lies." When Sunday came again, the church was half empty. Those who came sat quietly, no choir, no drums, just silence. Daniel stepped to the pulpit without notes. "Last week, I confessed," he said. "This week, I'll tell you why." He looked out at the weary faces. "We built a ministry that looked holy but hid pain. We taught forgiveness but practiced judgment. Today, I refuse to hide behind scripture while people suffer under it." He paused. "If you can't follow a flawed man, then follow Christ instead. He is the only one who never pretends." A long silence followed. Then someone began to sing, softly, shakily, an old hymn, "Amazing Grace." Soon the whole congregation joined. Miriam stood, tears streaming, and whispered the words. Grace, seated in the back with her mother, sang too. The sound filled the hall, fragile but real, like something broken being stitched together by mercy. A week later, the church council met again. Officer Ngozi handed Daniel a document. The investigation found no criminal intent severe enough for prosecution, but the church leadership requests disciplinary action, a temporary suspension for both of you. Daniel nodded. "We accept." Miriam's voice trembled. "How long?" 6 months, the officer replied. "During that time, you are encouraged to seek counseling and community service." Miriam exhaled shakily. "Thank you." Ngozi smiled faintly. "You're fortunate. Most people don't get a second chance." That night, Daniel sat in the dark sanctuary. Rain tapped against the roof like whispered prayers. He spoke softly into the emptiness. "Lord, I thought ministry was about sermons, but maybe it's about moments like this, when all you have left is truth." Behind him, footsteps echoed. Miriam approached and sat beside him. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. He turned to her. "Maybe not, but grace doesn't measure worthiness, it measures need." She rested her head on his shoulder, sobbing quietly. At the same hour, Grace unpacked her things in a small dormitory room. The scholarship letter from the church lay on her bed. She smiled, a small, grateful smile. She wasn't the same frightened girl anymore. She had seen darkness, but she had also seen honesty, and it had changed her. She whispered to herself, maybe this is what justice looks like, and maybe she was right. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in confession, in healing, in choosing truth when lies would be easier. 6 weeks after the council's verdict, the story that had shaken the church still refused to die. Radio talk shows debated it. A headline read, "When the Shepherd Stumbles." Everywhere Pastor Daniel went, eyes followed him, some curious, some kind, some cruel. Yet he walked with quiet purpose. He had begun visiting members' homes one by one, not to defend himself, but to listen, to ask what they needed, what they feared. People were surprised. The man they had once placed on a pedestal now sat on their front porches, drinking tea, talking about forgiveness. Miriam stayed mostly indoors, attending therapy and volunteering at the domestic workers' shelter. She scrubbed floors beside women she once would have called helpers. At first they avoided her. Then one day an older woman touched her hand and said, "We all need grace, madam." Miriam cried the rest of the afternoon. One evening, Pastor Daniel's phone rang. Elder Sarah's voice was calm but urgent. "Pastor, the district council wants a public hearing next Sunday. They want you and Sister Miriam to speak openly. People need closure." Daniel hesitated. "And if we refuse, they'll interpret silence as pride." He looked across the room at Miriam, who had overheard. Her face was pale, but she nodded. "We should face them." That night neither of them slept. The sound of rain on the roof was like a slow clock counting down to judgment. Sunday arrived gray and heavy. The hall was packed. Church members, journalists, neighboring pastors, even Grace with her mother. The council sat at a long table in front. Elder Matthew opened with prayer. "Lord, let truth heal rather than destroy." Then he turned to Daniel. "Pastor, you may speak." Daniel rose slowly. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today is not about saving a name. It's about saving a lesson." He looked toward Grace. "A wound was inflicted under my roof, not by a stranger, but by my wife. I failed to see her breaking and failed to protect someone who trusted us. I carry that failure." He paused. "Leadership means nothing if it hides behind reputation. The gospel isn't a crown, it's a cross." Gasps, murmurs, then silence again. He stepped back. "I accept every consequence that truth demands." When Miriam stood, her knees trembled. She faced the crowd, the faces she had once led in song, the eyes that now judged her. Her voice quivered. "There are no words that can undo what I did. I acted out of jealousy and fear. I let darkness speak louder than faith." She turned toward Grace. "You could have destroyed me, and no one would have blamed you, but you chose mercy. That mercy is why I can stand here today." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Miriam continued, "I am not asking for position or pity. I am asking to serve, not as leader, but as one who knows what pride can do." She sat down, covering her face. The hall was silent except for the rain tapping the windows. Elder Sarah looked toward the young woman. "Grace, do you wish to respond?" Grace stood slowly. She was nervous, but her voice was clear. "I came here today not to accuse, but to release." She looked at Miriam. "I forgive you again, because every day I must choose it anew. And to everyone listening, please remember, forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it invites healing to stand beside it." The entire room seemed to exhale at once. After deliberation, Elder Matthew spoke. "The council finds that Pastor Daniel and Sister Miriam have cooperated fully and shown repentance. They will continue their suspension for the full term, after which the congregation will vote on restoration." He closed his folder. "But before we end, I ask something of all of us, that we stop worshiping our leaders and start walking with them in truth." Applause rose, not loud, but honest. Daniel reached for Miriam's hand. She gripped it tightly, tears running freely now. Weeks passed again. The noise faded. The tabloids moved on to news stories. But in the quiet corners of the city, something beautiful happened. Members of the church began visiting the shelter Miriam worked in, bringing supplies and offering free classes for domestic workers. Grace, now back in school, volunteered on weekends, teaching basic literacy to the younger girls. One afternoon, Daniel visited the shelter. He found Miriam leading a small prayer circle, nothing grand, just a few women holding hands and whispering gratitude. When she saw him, she smiled shyly. "You used to preach to crowds," she said. "Now I preach to 5 women in a laundry room." He smiled back. "Maybe that's where the real church is." Later that day, Grace came to see them both. She carried a small envelope. "It's my first scholarship check," she said. "I wanted you to see it." Miriam took it with trembling hands. "You're becoming everything we prayed for." Grace nodded. "Because of what I learned here, that justice and mercy can walk together." She looked around the modest shelter hall and added, "People think this story was a scandal. I think it was a beginning." Months later, a journalist who had once mocked them wrote a column titled "When the Church Told the Truth." He ended it with, "Perhaps holiness isn't about being flawless, but about admitting the flaw and still choosing light." For the first time in many months, Daniel felt hope when he read an article about himself. He smiled, folded the paper, and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, he stood outside the church building, empty now, under a purple sunset. Miriam joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you think they'll ever trust us again?" she asked. "Some will," he said. "Some won't. But trust isn't the goal anymore. Truth is." She nodded. "Then we start again, with truth." They stood there quietly, the wind carrying distant laughter from the shelter nearby. Music swells to a gentle crescendo, because reckoning, he realized, isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's rebirth, the painful tearing down of pride so that something honest can grow in its place. Words. Morning light spilled across the churchyard like a quiet apology from heaven. It had been 6 months since the storm. The scandal, the hearing, the long nights of questions with no answers. And today, for the first time, the doors of the church were opening again for a full service led by Pastor Daniel. He stood outside early, breathing in the air that smelled of rain and fresh cut grass. In his hands was not a heavy Bible filled with sermon notes, but a small leather one, worn thin at the edges. Miriam joined him, dressed simply, without the elegance she once used as armor. Her smile was small, real. "I can't believe they want us back," she said. "They don't want perfection," he replied. "They want honesty." The sanctuary filled slowly. There were familiar faces, some who had stayed, some who had left and returned quietly. In the front row sat Grace, wearing a modest dress, her books beside her. When the time came, Daniel walked to the pulpit, heart pounding. He looked at the congregation, at Miriam, at Grace, then said softly, "I thought restoration meant being celebrated again, but I've learned it means being forgiven again and again, even when you don't deserve it." He opened to Micah 6:8. "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" His voice grew stronger. "Justice without mercy becomes cruelty. Mercy without justice becomes weakness. But when the two walk together, that's where God lives." He paused. "I want to thank Grace for reminding me what mercy looks like, and I want to thank every one of you who chose to stay and see us not as saints, but as people still learning grace." The crowd was silent. Then one by one, people began to stand, first Elder Sarah, then others, until nearly everyone was on their feet. No applause, only quiet reverence. After service, Grace lingered near the gate. Miriam approached her, holding a small wrap box. "It's nothing expensive," she said. "Just something to remind you that even ashes can bloom again." Grace opened it, a simple silver pendant engraved with the word renewed. She smiled. "I'll wear it when I graduate." "You're still studying social work, right?" Miriam asked. "Yes, I want to help girls like me, maids, students, anyone who thinks silence is the only way to survive." Miriam nodded, tears in her eyes. "That's what real ministry is." That night, Daniel sat alone in the same study where months earlier he had wept over his fallen home. Now the room smelled of new paint and candles. A small frame on his desk held a photo of the shelter volunteers smiling beside Grace. He opened his journal and wrote, "I used to think power was the ability to lead. Now I know it's the courage to admit when you've led badly and begin again. Justice is not revenge. Justice is love wearing truth." He closed the book and smiled. Under their guidance, the church launched a program called the Second Chance Initiative, a fund for victims of domestic abuse and displaced workers. Grace became its first coordinator. Miriam oversaw training workshops at the shelter. Every week, new faces arrived, women carrying stories too heavy for one lifetime. And every week, Daniel reminded them, "You are not your mistakes, and you are not someone else's cruelty. You are the reason Grace still works." Months later, Daniel received a letter from a neighboring pastor who had once judged him harshly. It read, "Your honesty saved my ministry. I was hiding a secret bitterness that was killing my family. When you stood before your church and told the truth, I realized I needed to do the same. Thank you for bleeding publicly so others could heal privately." Daniel folded the letter, humbled beyond words. Miriam continued to change quietly. She no longer sat on stage during services. She preferred the back row, near the widows she helped care for. One Sunday, Grace was the one who delivered the closing prayer. Her voice filled the hall with calm certainty. "Lord, thank you for showing us that the house of God is not made of bricks, but of broken hearts mended by your hands." When she finished, Miriam couldn't hold back tears. Afterward, Daniel whispered, "Do you see? What the world called scandal became sermon." That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, the three of them, Daniel, Miriam, and Grace, walked through the shelter garden. Children laughed nearby, chasing bubbles through the air. Miriam looked around and said softly, "Remember the day everything fell apart?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I remember the day everything began to heal." Grace bent down to pick a small flower, handed it to Miriam. "Keep it," she said. "It's proof that beauty doesn't ask permission to grow again." They laughed, quiet and free. Life didn't turn perfect after that. People still whispered sometimes. Not everyone forgave, but truth had taken root, and roots, when deep enough, survive every season. Pastor Daniel learned that leadership is not standing above people, but standing among them. Miriam learned that love without humility turns to pride. Grace learned that forgiveness is the highest form of strength, and the community learned that justice is not a moment, it's a way of living honestly, even when honesty costs something. Justice doesn't always come easy. Sometimes it crawls through shame and tears before it stands tall, but when it does, it leaves behind more than punishment, it leaves transformation. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes truth can heal, because every time we tell a story like this, we remind the world that mercy still has power.